Victor Steele had no idea what he was walking into when he took the night shift at Hollow Creek Motel. It seemed like just another job to him, a way to get by while he figured out his next move. The motel was old, rundown, and not the kind of place most people would want to stay at, let alone work at. Still, he felt a certain eagerness as he drove up to the motel that evening, the headlights of his car cutting through the thickening fog that had started to roll in. He could barely make out the silhouette of the building, its dull sign flickering with a weak light. The place had a reputation, sure, but it was just a few whispers at most. Nothing to worry about, right? The front door opened with a creak as Victor stepped inside, the smell of stale air and old carpet hitting him immediately. The dim light from the overhead bulb gave the lobby a cold, almost lifeless feel. Behind the counter sat Irene Wilder, the motel manager. Her eyes were focused on something she was scribbling in a notebook, and her sharp gaze lifted only briefly to meet Victor's as he approached. She didn't smile. Instead, her thin lips barely parted as she spoke in a voice that sent a chill down his spine. "You're the new night shift worker. Victor, right?" Her eyes scanned him quickly, then moved back to her notebook. "The rules are simple enough. Follow them, and you'll be fine. Break them, and, well, you'll see what happens." Victor raised an eyebrow, unsure if she was joking. "Rules?" he asked, though the words left his mouth more out of politeness than real curiosity. Irene's face remained blank, emotionless. "Don't ask too many questions. Just keep to yourself. If you follow the rules, things will go smoothly. Don't follow them, and you won't last the night." Victor nodded, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He wasn't the type to be intimidated easily, and the vague warnings weren't enough to get under his skin. After all, it was just a motel, right? She handed him a set of keys without another word and pointed towards the back hall. Victor followed her directions, but as he walked down the narrow corridor, something about the motel started to feel off. The lights flickered occasionally, and he could hear what sounded like footsteps in the distance, but whenever he turned a corner, no one was there. He brushed it off as his imagination, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. It was probably just the place. Old buildings always had their quirks. The silence was the most unsettling thing, though. Not the kind of silence where you could hear the occasional creak of wood or the hum of a fridge. No, this was a deeper silence, a thick, heavy stillness that seemed to press against him from all sides. It made the air feel colder, and the longer he stayed, the more he felt like he was suffocating under the weight of it. He found his way to the small office, where he was supposed to spend most of his shift. A stack of paperwork sat untouched on the desk, and the chair behind it creaked under his weight as he sat down. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, each second echoing like a reminder of how alone he was in the motel. As the night dragged on, Victor began to hear things. Soft whispers at first, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. He paused, straining his ears to catch the words, but it was always too faint. Then there were the noises coming from the rooms, creaks and groans, the sound of something dragging across the floor. It could have been the old pipes, or maybe the building settling. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that his nerves were just getting the best of him. It wasn't until he noticed a piece of paper shoved underneath the door to the office that things started to feel truly strange. The note was crumpled, the handwriting messy and hurried, as if the person who wrote it had been afraid. The ink was smeared in some places, but Victor could still make out the words. "Don't trust Irene. Don't stay in room 13. Cameron Frost was right. It will find you." Victor's heart skipped a beat. Cameron Frost. He'd heard the name before, a retired worker who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Everyone who worked here knew his story. No one knew exactly what happened to him, but some said he'd gone mad. The note seemed to confirm that something dark was lurking in the motel, but what exactly was it? Victor shoved the note into his pocket, his pulse quickening as he glanced around the empty office. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was waiting for him. Something, or someone. The hours passed, but the tension in the air never lifted. He kept looking over his shoulder, hearing sounds that didn't make sense, footsteps that echoed in the empty hallways, doors that creaked open on their own, the faintest trace of a whisper in his ear when there was no one there. At times, it felt like the motel itself was alive, breathing with an eerie, unnatural energy. Victor shook his head, trying to dismiss the thoughts racing through his mind. It was just nerves. It had to be. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. The sense that something was watching him, following him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The clock ticked on, but the night was no longer the calm, routine shift he had expected. The unsettling quiet, the whispers, the strange note. It all hung in the air, thick and suffocating. And as the hours stretched on, Victor couldn't help but wonder just how long he would last in a place like this. Something told him that Hollow Creek Motel wasn't just any ordinary motel. The rules Irene had mentioned weren't just suggestions. They were a warning. A warning that, if he didn't listen, he might just become another name on the list of people who had disappeared, never to be seen again. Victor glanced towards the hallway, his breath catching in his throat as the shadows seemed to shift. Something was coming, something he wasn't ready to face. And the worst part, he had no idea what it was. Victor sat behind the desk, trying to focus on the paperwork in front of him, but the eerie silence of the motel kept gnawing at him. The hours seemed to stretch on forever, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the motel was more than it appeared. It wasn't just the note he had found, or the strange sounds he kept hearing. It was the way everything felt. Off. The door to the office creaked open, pulling Victor's attention away from his thoughts. Standing in the doorway was Hugo Drake, the seasoned night shift worker who had been there long before Victor. Hugo's face was tired, lined with the kind of exhaustion that only years of working the night shift could bring. But his eyes were sharp, a certain understanding in them that Victor didn't quite know how to place. "You look like you've got a lot of questions," Hugo said, stepping into the office and shutting the door behind him. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You're gonna need to know the rules if you're gonna make it through tonight." Victor straightened up in his chair, intrigued but wary. "Rules?" Hugo nodded, his gaze flicking over to the hall, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Rules you won't find in any manual. They're not written down anywhere. Hell, most people never hear about them, but you'll learn them soon enough, whether you want to or not." Victor swallowed, feeling the weight of Hugo's words settle in the air around them. What kind of rules? Hugo leaned against the counter, folding his arms. His eyes narrowed, and he looked at Victor with a strange mix of pity and seriousness. "Rule number 1. Never leave the office after midnight. I don't care what you hear or what happens, you stay behind that desk. The moment you step out, the motel takes notice, and it doesn't like being ignored." Victor's mind raced. Stay behind the desk. It didn't sound so bad, but there was a sense of urgency in Hugo's voice, as if this wasn't just some quirky precaution. It was a matter of survival. Hugo wasn't joking. "There's a second rule, too," Hugo continued, glancing at the clock on the wall. "And it's just as important. Never let anyone into room 13. If they're not already checked in, you send them on their way. Doesn't matter who they are, what they say, or how desperate they look. You tell them we're full, and that's it. Room 13 is off limits. Always." Victor frowned. "Room 13. Why?" Hugo's expression darkened. "That room has a history, a bad one. Don't even think about looking inside. The people who've stayed there, well, they don't come out the same. And sometimes, they don't come out at all." Victor's curiosity bubbled up, but he quickly bit it back. He could feel the tension in Hugo's voice, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know anymore. Still, Something inside him, some instinct, told him that he wasn't going to be able to avoid these mysteries forever. "There's more," Hugo said, interrupting his thoughts. "You have to keep your distance from the guests. Don't get involved in their business. You'll know when you see them. Trust me. They're different. Just do your job and don't ask questions. The fewer questions you ask, the safer you'll be." Victor was about to speak when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A woman standing by the door to room 13, watching them. Her gaze was intense, almost predatory, and for a moment, it felt like she could see right through him. She wasn't moving, just standing there in the hallway, her posture stiff. The dim light from the hallway cast strange shadows across her face, making her look even more unsettling. Her eyes were fixed on him, unblinking. Victor's breath caught in his throat. Who's that?" Hugo turned, following Victor's gaze. His face hardened. "Celine Hawk. She's a guest in room 13. Stay away from her." Victor couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine as Hugo's words echoed in his mind. Stay away from her. There was something about Celine that didn't sit right. She was too still, too focused, like she was studying him. Hugo sighed, a tired, defeated sound. "She's been staying here on and off for years. You don't want to know what she's really here for." Victor felt a wave of unease wash over him. He glanced back at Celine, but she was gone, vanishing back into the shadows of the hallway like a ghost. The brief moment of eye contact had left him with an uncomfortable feeling that he couldn't shake. It was as though she knew something he didn't, and that scared him more than anything else. Hugo turned back to Victor, his expression grim. "You'll learn the rest of the rules as you go, but the important thing is, you follow them. Do what you're told, and you'll make it through. Break the rules, and, well, you've seen what happens to people who don't listen." Victor nodded, his mind racing. He wanted to ask more, to press for answers, but the look in Hugo's eyes told him that the less he knew, the better. There were things happening in this motel, things that no one outside would ever believe. As Hugo walked toward the door, he paused, casting one last glance at Victor. "Remember, you're not just working here. You're surviving. And you can't do that without the rules." Victor watched Hugo leave, the door clicking shut behind him. He was left alone in the quiet office once again, but this time, the silence felt heavier, darker. There were rules here, rules that couldn't be ignored, rules that kept something locked away, something he wasn't ready to face. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt the pull of whatever it was lurking in the shadows. And in that moment, Victor knew one thing for sure. His first night at Hollow Creek Motel was only just beginning. The first few hours of Victor's shift were uneventful, or at least they seemed that way at first. The office was quiet, the clock on the wall ticking in rhythm with his heartbeat as he stared at the empty lobby. The cold light from the old fluorescent bulb overhead flickered occasionally, but that was nothing new. He'd seen lights do that in older buildings before. But as the night wore on, something began to gnaw at him. It started small, with the feeling that the walls were just a little too quiet. The silence wasn't natural, not like the peaceful quiet of a normal night. It was more like the stillness before a storm, like something was waiting. At first, he ignored it. He pulled out his phone, trying to distract himself with something normal. But the sounds, they couldn't be ignored. Soft, almost imperceptible whispers floated through the air, too faint to make out the words but unmistakable all the same. They came from the hall outside, like someone was standing just beyond the door, muttering to themselves. Victor's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to breathe. It was probably just the pipes or the wind. He tried to focus, but the sounds didn't stop. Every so often, he heard footsteps, light and shuffling, walking in the hall. He checked the security cameras. They showed nothing, only empty corridors. Still, the noises continued. The sound of soft footfalls, the faint whispers, like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Victor stood up from behind the desk, his legs feeling heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. He walked toward the hallway, his shoes tapping softly against the floor. The hallway was empty, too empty. The flickering lights above cast long, distorted shadows, making the place seem even more unnerving. Suddenly, the door to room 8 creaked open. Victor froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The door hadn't been opened in hours. He could have sworn it had been locked when he checked earlier, but now it was ajar, just slightly, as if someone had left in a hurry. He stepped toward it, his fingers brushing against the doorframe, as if it were a hot stove. The cold draft that swept from the room made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The air inside the room felt wrong, heavy with a chill that cut straight through his jacket. Victor quickly stepped back, his breath coming out in sharp gasps. The lights above him flickered again, and for a moment, he thought he saw something, or someone, standing in the dark corner of the room. It was impossible to tell. His mind played tricks on him, or so he told himself. Victor turned, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but that's when he saw her. A woman, tall, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed too bright for the dim light of the lobby. She stepped into view, almost as if she had materialized out of thin air. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She wasn't rushing. She didn't seem afraid. "Can I help you?" Victor asked, his voice a little unsteady. The woman gave him a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're Victor, right?" she asked, her voice oddly calm. She didn't seem bothered by the strange atmosphere that was making his skin crawl. Victor nodded, unsure how she knew his name. "Yeah, I just started tonight." The woman didn't seem to care much about the answer. "I'm Zora Quinn," she said, her eyes scanning the empty lobby, as if checking for something. "I'm staying in room 10. Victor glanced at the hallway, but Zora was still staring at him, her expression unreadable. There was something off about her, something about the way she moved, too deliberate, too careful. She was aware of every little sound, every step she took. It was like she was walking on eggshells. "Is everything okay?" Victor asked, his voice quieter now, as if the oppressive silence of the motel was weighing down on him. Zara took a slow breath, almost like she was gathering her thoughts. "The rules," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've been told about the rules, right?" Victor blinked, feeling a sudden rush of unease. The rules. Her eyes flicked to the hallway, her face going pale, as if she had seen something she shouldn't have. "The rules are real," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what kind of place this is, but you need to follow them. If you don't, you'll regret it." Victor felt a chill creep down his spine. "What do you mean?" Zara's eyes darted to the hallway again. For a moment, it seemed like she was looking right through him, her gaze lost in something far beyond the motel walls. "I've been here for a few days now," she said quietly, "and I've seen things, heard things, things that make you question what's real. The motel, it's not what it seems. Whatever you do, don't break the rules. They'll make you pay for it." Victor's mind raced, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He felt his palms begin to sweat. "What kind of things?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara hesitated, her eyes darting back to the dark hallway. "I can't tell you, but you'll see for yourself soon enough. Just remember what I said. Follow the rules. You'll be safe if you do." Victor stood there for a long moment, his stomach twisted in knots. He wanted to ask more, to press for answers, but Zara seemed to grow even more uneasy the longer he stood there. She turned away quickly, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she disappeared into the shadows. Victor stood frozen for a few seconds, the words she left hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Follow the rules. Stay safe. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Was the motel haunted? Or was something darker, more sinister, at work here? The lights flickered once more, and he jumped. The silence felt suffocating, like something was waiting, watching. Victor glanced at the clock. Still hours left before his shift would end. He wanted to leave, to get out of there, but he knew that wasn't an option. Not anymore. As he sat back behind the desk, the shadows around him seemed to stretch further, and the whispers in the hallway grew louder. The rules. That was all he could focus on now. But which ones? How many of them were true? And most importantly, what would happen if he broke them? Victor didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. The night had only just begun. And the motel. The motel wasn't done with him yet. Victor couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the guests at Hollow Creek Motel. Every time he passed by a room, he saw glimpses of strange behavior. It was subtle, but undeniable. The motel was supposed to be a quiet, rundown place, but the people staying here were different. They weren't normal guests. They seemed trapped, somehow, just like him. The most unsettling of them all was Celine Hawk, who stayed in room 13. She never left. At least, that's what Victor noticed. He'd seen her in the lobby a few times, but it was always for a moment, always on her way back to her room. No one had ever seen her outside. Not once. Her pale face, framed by long dark hair, was almost haunting. And the way she looked at him when their eyes met, it wasn't the gaze of a normal guest. There was something cold and distant in her eyes, like she wasn't really seeing him at all. It felt like she was looking through him, past him, to something that Victor couldn't even begin to understand. It was the mirrors that made her even more unsettling. Whenever Victor passed her room, he could see her standing in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. She wasn't moving, just staring. Her eyes never blinked, never shifted. It was like she was lost in the glass, like she was waiting for something. He never saw her leave the room for anything, not even to get food. He checked the security cameras, but all he saw was an empty hallway, her door slightly ajar, and the sound of muffled whispers coming from within. Zara Quinn noticed him watching her too. The moment Victor passed by her room, Zara always appeared. She'd watch him from her doorway with those sharp, knowing eyes, as if she had seen everything that happened in the motel before it even occurred. One night, she stopped him before he could go back to the office. "You're watching her again," Zara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't need to ask who she meant. Room 13. Celine. Victor stiffened. She doesn't leave her room. Doesn't seem normal. Zara glanced down the hall, her face hardening. Nothing here is normal. You've seen it, haven't you? The way she stares at herself in the mirror, how she never comes out. She's not just locked in that room, Victor. She's trapped by the motel. Victor felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? It's she. Okay. Zara shook her head, her eyes filled with something darker. She's not the first. A lot of workers have gone missing here. You've heard the stories, haven't you? People who didn't follow the rules. They vanish without a trace. It's like they were never here at all. Victor felt a lump in his throat. The rules. Zara looked at him seriously. You'll understand soon enough. But for now, just remember this. Celine Hawk isn't the only one. The rules are meant to keep you safe, but they also keep you in line. If you cross them, if you step out of bounds. Her voice trailed off, and she turned away quickly, disappearing back into her room before Victor could ask more. Victor stood there, staring at the door where Zara had just been. A cold sense of dread settled in his stomach. Something was very wrong here. He had thought it was just the place. The old building, the strange noises, the weird atmosphere. But now, with Zara's cryptic words echoing in his mind, he realized it was more than that. This motel, it wasn't just run down. It was alive, in a way. It was watching him. And it had been watching all the people who'd come through its doors before him. The next few hours were a blur of anxiety and tension. Victor couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around him knew something he didn't. Every time he looked at Celine's room, her shadow seemed to move just behind the curtain, and he could swear he saw her reflection in the lobby mirrors, though she wasn't actually there. Every now and then, he heard soft laughter or whispers from down the hall, but when he went to check, there was no one there. It wasn't just Celine. Zara, too, had started acting strange, almost as if she were trying to warn him without saying too much. Her warnings had become more frequent, more cryptic. She had mentioned the vanishing workers, but Victor hadn't really understood until now. The workers didn't just leave. They disappeared. And when they did, it was like they never existed. No one ever spoke of them again. Victor glanced over at the desk, where the small pile of old maintenance reports lay. He grabbed one and flipped through the pages, trying to distract himself. But as his eyes scanned the lines, something caught his attention. There, buried in the fine print of a work order, was a name he recognized: Cameron Frost. He had disappeared years ago, and everyone had assumed it was just another runaway worker. But there was a note at the end of the report, something in small print that didn't make sense. The mirrors were his downfall. Do not trust them. Victor's blood ran cold. The mirrors. He slammed the report down and rubbed his face, trying to shake off the creeping dread. It was too much. This whole place, this whole situation, was turning his mind upside down. He stood up and walked toward the hallway, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty space. The walls felt like they were closing in around him. He passed by room 13 again, and the door was ajar, just a crack. He didn't dare look inside, but his feet carried him closer to the door. He had to know. As he approached, the air grew colder, the hallway darker. Then, just as he was about to reach out to push the door fully open, he heard something. It wasn't the usual whispering or faint noises. This was different. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Someone, or something, was tapping on the other side of the door. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it. Victor's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't move. His body refused to obey his mind. The tapping grew louder, almost frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was trying to get out. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, but before he could touch the handle, it stopped. The silence was absolute. For a moment, Victor just stood there, his breath caught in his throat, his mind racing with questions. What was going on? Was it Celine? Was she the one tapping? Was she trying to tell him something? But the longer he stood there, the more he felt the weight of the motel around him. He could feel it, pulling at him, making his thoughts spiral into confusion and fear. The place was alive, and it wasn't done with him yet. Victor couldn't stop thinking about Cameron Frost, the night worker who had vanished without a trace. There had to be more to it than just him leaving, as everyone seemed to believe. Something was off about his disappearance, and Victor could feel it in his gut. He'd heard whispers of Cameron from other staff, but they always hushed up when they saw Victor listening too closely. It was as if speaking too much about Cameron was against some invisible rule. One night, while cleaning out the storage room in the back of the motel, Victor stumbled upon something unexpected. At the very back, hidden behind old cleaning supplies and broken furniture, was a box. It looked like it had been there for years, dusty and forgotten. Curiosity pulled him in, and he carefully pulled the box out. It was heavy, its wood splintered from age, but the contents inside felt even heavier, like secrets that had been buried for far too long. Inside, he found a journal. It was old, its pages yellowed, but the ink was still legible. Victor flipped it open, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the name on the first page. Noah Vega. He had heard that name before. Noah was the first night worker, the one who had left behind cryptic clues that no one understood. The journal was filled with strange notes, half-finished thoughts, and disjointed ramblings, but the more Victor read, the more a pattern began to form. No one escapes the mirrors, the first entry said. Another page had a drawing of the motel's layout, but with strange markings around certain rooms. Room 13 was circled 3 times, and there was an odd squiggly line that ran from the room down into the foundation. The word scribbled next to it read, "The heart of it all." Victor's pulse quickened. What was Noah trying to tell him? As he read through more of the journal, the clues grew darker. References to people who had come and gone, workers who had disappeared under strange circumstances, and eerie warnings about the rules that no one dared break. Each entry seemed to warn of an impending doom, but none of the warnings made sense. Noah was trying to expose something, but what? The journal ended abruptly. The last entry was a chaotic jumble of symbols and letters, none of which made sense. It was like Noah had known something was coming, something he couldn't outrun. Victor felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had to know more. But before he could think further, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Victor. The voice was soft at first, barely a whisper. He turned around, but no one was there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the voice came again, clearer this time. Victor, you're getting too close. Victor's heart raced. It was coming from nowhere, an eerie, disembodied voice that seemed to echo in his mind. It wasn't coming from a speaker. It wasn't coming from any of the guests. It was just there. A cold shiver ran down his back. Who's there? Victor asked, his voice shaking slightly. The words felt weak, powerless in the heavy air of the motel. You're not supposed to know, the voice said, now a little louder, more distinct. But I'm here to guide you. You found the journal, haven't you? The pieces are falling into place. Victor froze. His mind raced. Guide me? He was sure he hadn't imagined it. The voice, it was real. But it sounded too calm, too sure of itself. It knew things about him, things he hadn't shared with anyone. Who are you? Victor demanded, his voice growing stronger despite the fear swirling in his chest. I am the caller, the voice replied. I've been watching. I've been waiting for you to understand. Now that you've found the journal, it's time. Time for what? Victor felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't like where this was going. He didn't want to know more, not now. But deep down, he couldn't resist. There was something about the voice, something compelling, pulling him forward. The truth is hidden beneath your feet, the caller continued. The basement. That's where it all begins. Victor didn't know what to do. His head was spinning, the weight of the journal in his hands growing heavier with every word. But the voice was right. Something was down there. Something he had to see. He couldn't ignore it. His curiosity overpowered his fear. With the journal clutched in his hands, Victor made his way to the motel's old maintenance area. He had passed by it before, but had never given it much thought. The door was rusted, and the stairs leading down were hidden behind a stack of crates. But now, with the voice in his head urging him on, it felt like he had no choice. The door creaked loudly as he pulled it open. The air in the room was thick with dust, and the stairs leading down to the basement were dimly lit by a flickering bulb. Victor hesitated at the top of the stairs, but the voice pressed him forward. Go down, Victor. You're so close now. You need to see it all. Victor swallowed hard, his breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to go, but he couldn't turn back now. Something was calling him. He descended the stairs, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the darkness. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the motel itself was pulling him down into its depths. When he reached the bottom, the basement was cold. Freezing cold, his breath misted in the air. The walls were lined with old pipes and rusted machinery, and the smell of mold hung in the air. But in the far corner, behind a large broken shelf, there was something else. A door. A small unmarked door that Victor had never noticed before. He approached it cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The door was old, made of thick wood, and the faintest markings were carved into it. It looked like something had been scratched out over time, but the symbols weren't clear enough to read. Victor reached for the door handle. Just as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a voice echoed in his mind again. The caller. It's time, the voice whispered. What you're about to uncover will change everything. Victor hesitated, a wave of dread washing over him, but something inside urged him on. With one final breath, he turned the handle, and stepped inside. The door creaked open, revealing the unknown. The truth about Hollow Creek Motel was waiting for him, and Victor couldn't turn back now. Victor stepped inside the hidden basement, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The door slammed shut behind him with an eerie finality, plunging him into a dim, oppressive darkness. The only light came from a flickering bulb overhead, casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. The smell of decay and dampness filled the air, and every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet seemed to echo louder than it should have. As he moved further into the basement, his breath came in short, ragged bursts. There was something wrong about this place, something deep in his bones that told him to leave. But he couldn't. Not after everything he had learned. Not now. The basement stretched out before him, with rows of old crates and boxes piled up in disarray. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something more disturbing. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deeply into the wood and stone. Some were simple, like circles and lines, while others were more intricate, resembling patterns he couldn't quite recognize. Some seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and he swore he saw them shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Victor's heart pounded in his chest. He had to know more. He moved cautiously, picking his way through the clutter, until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. Tucked away in a corner, behind a pile of old papers and forgotten furniture, was a small, tattered book. It looked like it had been left there for decades. His fingers trembled as he reached for it, and when he opened it, the pages were filled with more strange writing, similar to the journal he had found earlier, but with one big difference. The language was different, almost ancient. The script was so twisted that it looked like it had been scratched out with a jagged knife. Victor's eyes narrowed as he read the first few lines. The words felt wrong, as though they were pulling at something deep inside him, something that didn't want to be found. The author's name was scrawled in the back, Darius Holt. It was a name Victor had never heard before, but the dates written under it sent a chill through his spine. Darius had been another night worker, one of the many who had vanished without explanation. The journal's final words were just as cryptic and unsettling as Noah's. They are always watching. The mirrors, the watchers, they're waiting. Victor's skin crawled. He had read similar things in Noah's journal, but this was more specific. It was as if Darius had seen something that had broken him, something that had driven him to disappear. What had they all seen? What was this place? As he turned the pages, his mind raced. The deeper he read, the more the words seemed to blur together, until everything in front of him began to warp and twist. The room shifted around him, the shadows growing longer and deeper. The air felt thick, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that Victor's breath misted in the cold. His vision blurred, and suddenly, the walls seemed to ripple like water. He shook his head violently, trying to clear his mind, but the hallucinations kept coming. In one moment, he saw a figure, familiar but distorted, lurking in the shadows. It looked like someone he knew, but the features were warped, stretched out of shape. In the next moment, the figure was gone, replaced by a disorienting blur of movement and color. Victor stumbled back, his hand gripping the nearest shelf for support. His pulse was racing, and every part of him screamed to turn around to run. But he couldn't. He had to know the truth. He had to understand what was happening to him, what was happening to the motel. And then, as if answering his unspoken question, the mirrors around him began to hum. At first, it was a low, faint vibration, like the buzz of a distant wasp. But then it grew louder, deeper, and suddenly, every mirror in the basement flickered to life. They were scattered across the walls, hidden among the clutter. The glass gleamed, but there was something wrong with it. Something unsettling. Victor's breath hitched as he stared into one of the mirrors. He could see his reflection, but it was distorted, twisted in ways he couldn't explain. His face seemed to flicker, like the mirror couldn't quite decide who he was. But then, in the reflection behind him, he saw something else. A figure, a tall, thin silhouette standing just out of view, hidden by the edges of the mirror. Its features were shadowed, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, its head tilting ever so slightly, as if it was studying him, waiting for something. Victor's heart raced as the air around him grew heavier, thick with an oppressive presence. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. His eyes were glued to the mirror, his body frozen in place by the dread crawling up his spine. The figure in the glass didn't blink, didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him. Then, a soft voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, swirling around him like a whispered threat. Victor. Victor's stomach dropped. It was the voice again. The same one that had been guiding him, taunting him, ever since he stepped into the motel. This time, it was different. There was a coldness to it, an edge that sent a shiver down his spine. "You're getting too close," the voice whispered, as if it knew exactly what he was thinking. "You've seen them, but you don't understand yet." The figure in the mirror moved closer, its head tilting more, as if inspecting him, its eyes unreadable, cold. Victor couldn't take his eyes off of it, his whole body frozen in terror. It was like the mirror wasn't just reflecting his image. It was a portal, pulling him in, trapping him. The figure's mouth opened slightly, revealing sharp, unsettling teeth that seemed to glimmer in the mirror's light. Then, in a blink, the figure was gone. The mirrors returned to their usual state, cold and empty, reflecting only the dim, flickering light of the bulb above. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Victor's mind raced. Was he truly alone in the basement? Or had something else been there, something hiding in the mirrors, watching him the entire time? The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows creeping closer with every breath he took. And as the voice faded into silence, Victor knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in this motel, whatever was watching him, wasn't going to let him leave without learning its twisted truth. Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't just the mirrors now. It was everywhere, closing in on him, pressing against his skin, suffocating him with an invisible force. He could feel the eyes of something, or someone, staring at him. It was Lydia. At first, it was subtle, a glimpse out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement in the mirror that he couldn't quite explain. But then it became clearer, more direct. She was there, standing behind him, her ghostly figure reflected in the glass. Her face was pale, almost featureless, except for her eyes. Deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Her mouth opened, and her voice, soft and cold, echoed in his head. "You shouldn't have come," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady pulse of his heart in his ears. "The rules, you're breaking them, and they'll come for you." Victor froze, his heart skipping a beat. He whipped his head around, but the room was empty. No sign of her, no footsteps, nothing. Yet her voice lingered, like a shadow, pressing against the back of his mind. He stared at the mirror again, and there she was. Lydia. Her ghostly figure shimmered, like a reflection in a broken glass. Her lips moved, but her words didn't make sense. They were fragmented, disjointed, a jumble of warnings that Victor couldn't understand. Some parts of her speech were clearer than others. "You're too late." The others, they didn't listen. But no matter how hard he tried, the rest of her words slipped away from him, like trying to catch fog with his bare hands. Victor felt his stomach twist. This was different from the other whispers, different from the strange voice of the caller. This was real. This was Lydia, a part of the motel's dark history, a history he couldn't escape from, no matter how much he wanted to. The more he saw of Lydia, the more desperate her warnings became. Her ghostly figure appeared in every mirror he passed. Sometimes she was behind him, sometimes in front of him, but always watching, always waiting. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world, but he didn't. Her presence filled him with dread, as if every second he spent in her gaze pulled him deeper into the curse that had trapped her here. Victor couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Every time he opened them, she was there, standing just behind the mirror, her hollow eyes boring into him. He couldn't escape it. No matter where he went in the motel, Lydia followed him, like a dark cloud hanging over his head, her whispers growing louder with every passing moment. The rules. He needed to follow the rules. But which rules? And what would happen if he didn't? The caller's voice continued to echo in his mind, but now there was something different about it. Something darker. At first it had seemed like it was guiding him, helping him make sense of the strange events that had unfolded. But now it didn't feel like guidance anymore. It felt like manipulation. The voice was more insistent, more commanding. It wasn't just giving him advice. It was steering him, pushing him toward something, like a marionette on strings. Victor tried to ignore it. He tried to push back against the growing sense of dread that gripped him, but it was no use. He was trapped. The more he learned about the motel, the more he realized that it was far more than just a cursed building. It was alive, in a way. Alive in a twisted, unnatural way that no one could escape. It fed on fear. It lived in the shadows. It watched, waited, and twisted everything it touched. And Lydia, the ghost, was just the beginning. Her warnings were too real, too urgent. She had been a part of this place, a worker, someone who had been trapped here, just like him. But she had been here longer. She had seen things that drove her to madness. She had broken the rules. And now she was paying the price. Victor's heart raced as he thought about the other guests. The strange way they acted. The way they all seemed to know something he didn't. Zara Quinn, with her cryptic warnings. Celine Hawk, always watching from her room. They were all part of this twisted web. And now, he was too. The fear gnawed at him. Was there any escape? Was he already too far gone? Lydia's warning echoed louder in his ears. He could feel the walls of the motel closing in, suffocating him with the weight of its dark history. He couldn't stop thinking about the mirror warden, the figure in the reflection that watched him, always watching. Was that Lydia, or something else? Something darker, something that had been here long before her. Victor didn't know. And that terrified him even more. As the days dragged on, the motel's grip on him tightened. He could feel it now, the pull of something sinister, something that didn't want him to leave. It was a slow burn, creeping beneath his skin, pulling at his sanity with each passing moment. And Lydia, the ghost, was always there, a constant reminder of the price he would pay if he failed to follow the rules. Victor's mind was unraveling. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. The voices, the reflections, the shadows, everything was twisted. Everything was wrong. And the more he saw of Lydia, the more he realized that he might be doomed to repeat her fate. Trapped, lost, forever part of the motel's cursed history. And just when he thought he could take no more, the voice of the caller came again, sharp and cold. You've made your choice, Victor. There's no turning back now. Victor couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. At first it was just the small things, the way the mirrors seemed to reflect more than just his face, like they were showing something else, something hidden beneath the surface. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The reflections weren't just distorted, they were alive. He saw figures moving in the glass, people he didn't recognize, their eyes locked onto his, as if they were reaching out to him, trying to pull him into the cold, endless depths of the mirrors. It started one night when he passed a mirror in the hallway. He was tired, barely keeping his eyes open after another sleepless day filled with strange whispers and dark corners. As he walked past, he glanced at his reflection. But it wasn't him staring back. Instead, he saw a man, pale, hollow-eyed, and wearing the faded uniform of a motel worker. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, only a muffled, distorted hum, like an old TV struggling to tune into a channel. Victor blinked, and the figure was gone. He took a step back, trying to rationalize it. "It's just exhaustion," he told himself. "You're seeing things. It's the stress." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The mirrors weren't just reflecting what was in front of them. They were showing something else, something that shouldn't exist. He tried to ignore it, but the reflections started getting worse. As days passed, they became more frequent, more disturbing. He'd look into one mirror and see the room behind him, but it was empty, dark, cold, like a different version of the motel. One that was falling apart, forgotten, and haunted. Sometimes he'd look into a mirror and see a worker's face, his eyes wide with terror, silently screaming, but Victor couldn't hear a sound. Other times, he'd see himself, but his reflection would be smiling, a twisted, mocking grin that didn't match his own fear. That's when he met Martin Hodge, the janitor. Martin had been a quiet presence in the motel, always in the background, always cleaning, but never speaking much. Victor had never thought to ask him about the strange things happening, but one night, as he passed the man mopping the floors near the hall mirror, Martin stopped him with a weary, haunted look in his eyes. "You see them too, don't you?" Martin's voice was low, barely a whisper. Victor nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. "The reflections, they're not right." Martin sighed, looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "The mirrors, they're not just mirrors. They're portals, gateways to another world. A world where the souls of those who've disappeared are trapped." Victor stared at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Portals? What are you talking about?" Martin's eyes flickered with fear, like he was reliving something he didn't want to remember. "The workers who vanished, the ones who broke the rules, they didn't just leave. They got pulled in. The mirrors, they hold them, trap them in a place that isn't real. It's a reflection of this world, but twisted. A place where time bends and everything gets lost." Victor felt his stomach drop. The motel, the mirrors, the strange whispers, it all started to make a terrifying kind of sense. The people he had seen in the mirrors, the strange figures, were they trapped, just like Martin said? Were they trapped in some sort of reflection of the motel? And if so, what did that mean for him? The air around him grew heavy, thick with the weight of the motel's dark history. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the reflections seemed to multiply. Victor looked into the nearest mirror again, his breath catching in his throat. This time, he saw the same twisted reflection of himself, but something was different. The figure in the mirror, his reflection, wasn't mimicking his movements anymore. It was moving on its own, its eyes locked on him with an eerie intensity, its grin widening slowly, stretching unnaturally. Victor stumbled back, his heart racing. He turned away, but as he did, the reflection stayed, watching, mocking. The mirror warden was taking control. Victor could feel it now, the power of the mirrors, the way they seemed to bend reality itself. The more he tried to escape it, the more it pulled him in. Time started to blur. He'd go to sleep, but when he woke, he couldn't remember how much time had passed. It felt like days, or maybe hours, but the world around him had changed. The motel was darker, the air colder, and the mirrors, always the mirrors, were closer, more invasive. They reflected not just the physical world, but his thoughts, his fears. His every move felt like it was being watched, analyzed, like the mirrors knew him better than he knew himself. He was losing track of what was real. He didn't know what was him and what was the reflection anymore. Sometimes, when he stood in front of a mirror, he'd see a different version of himself, a version that was smiling, looking calm, almost serene. But it wasn't him. It couldn't be. The smile was too wide, too cruel, and the eyes. They weren't his eyes. They were cold, dead eyes, like the souls trapped inside the mirrors were trying to break free. Victor started to question everything. Was the motel playing tricks on him? Was he really going insane, or was something more sinister at work? The more he learned about the mirrors, the more he realized how deeply the motel was tied to something far worse than he had ever imagined. The mirror warden wasn't just a spirit. It was something much older, much more dangerous. It controlled the mirrors, and through them, it controlled him. The nights were the worst. That's when the reflections were the strongest, when they moved of their own accord, when the mirror warden reached out through the glass and dragged him deeper into the madness. He couldn't tell how long he had been trapped in this nightmare. He couldn't remember when it all started or how it was supposed to end. All he knew was that he had to get out. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized there was no way out. Not unless he played by the rules. But even the rules were beginning to change, slipping away like smoke in his fingers. He didn't know who to trust anymore. He didn't know if anything he saw was real. The motel's grip on him was tightening, and the more he struggled, the more he felt himself slipping into the very same nightmare that had claimed the others. The world was bending, shifting, and Victor had no idea what would happen if he couldn't escape the mirrors before they claimed him too. Victor's desperation to understand the truth was starting to overtake him, pushing him past the point of reason. Every warning he received seemed to echo in his mind, but the allure of the motel's twisted mysteries only grew stronger. He had already seen so much, and he couldn't just walk away. He needed to know what was really going on. He could feel the pull, the weight of the motel's secrets gnawing at him, begging to be uncovered. Each day, the strange events grew more intense, and his sanity started to fray. He knew the rules, but they felt more like chains than anything that might protect him. And so, one night, when the air in the motel felt colder than usual, he broke another rule. It happened when he decided to enter room 13, the room Zora had warned him about, the one Lydia Cross had been tied to. He had resisted for so long, but his curiosity was too strong. When he opened the door, it wasn't like any of the other rooms. The air inside felt thick, like it was alive, and the shadows seemed to move as if they had a mind of their own. The room was darker than any other, with an almost unnatural stillness to it. As Victor stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that made the walls tremble. He turned around, his heart racing, but it was already too late. The rules had been broken, and the consequences were immediate. The reflection in the mirror on the far wall wasn't his own this time. It was Lydia, but not the Lydia he had seen before. She wasn't a ghost anymore. This time, she seemed to be part of the motel, a living part of it, her face distorted with anguish, her eyes hollow and empty. She reached out toward him from the mirror, her fingers pressing against the glass, as if trying to grab him. Victor took a step back, but the mirror didn't stop her. Her hand came through, materializing like smoke, and she grabbed his arm with a cold, iron grip. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice a faint echo that sent chills crawling up his spine. Victor fought to pull away, but the grip only tightened, dragging him closer to the mirror. "You've broken the rules," she hissed. "Now you're part of this place. It's too late." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls closed in, the air thickened, and the temperature dropped. Lydia's form started to ripple and distort, as if her essence was being swallowed up by the motel itself. She was no longer just a ghost. She was becoming one with the building. Her soul fused with the walls, the mirrors, the very foundation of the place. She was everywhere, in every corner, every shadow. The realization hit him hard. This motel wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a living entity, one that consumed the souls of those who dared to break its rules. As Lydia's form faded, Victor staggered back, gasping for breath. The room seemed to pulse around him, alive with an energy he couldn't understand. He felt himself slipping, like he was being pulled into something he couldn't escape. The floor seemed to buckle beneath his feet, the walls twisting and contorting. He wasn't alone. He could hear the whispers now, louder than ever before, coming from every direction, from every mirror, from every crack in the walls. They were the voices of the lost workers, the ones who had broken the rules before him, their souls trapped here, forever part of the motel. The door to room 13 opened suddenly, and Zara Quinn was standing there, her face pale, her eyes filled with the same fear Victor had been carrying since the first night he arrived. She stepped inside without a word and closed the door behind her, her gaze locking with his. She didn't have to say anything. Her expression told him everything. He had gone too far. There was no turning back now. "You shouldn't have broken the rules," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Now you're one of them." Victor's heart raced. "What do you mean? What's happening to me?" Zara shook her head, her eyes haunted. "The motel feeds on curiosity. It draws you in, traps you in its web, and once you're caught, it doesn't let you go. It traps your soul in the mirrors, like it did to the others. Once you break the rules, it takes everything. You can't escape. You'll become part of this place. You'll never leave." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. The realization settled in like a thick fog. This place didn't just trap people. It consumed them, slowly, piece by piece, until they were nothing more than echoes in the mirrors, lost and forgotten. And now, Victor understood. He had been warned, over and over again, but his need for answers had clouded his judgment. The motel had won. It had claimed him, just like it had claimed everyone else before him. Zara stepped closer, her eyes filled with sorrow. "There's still time. You can leave. You can walk away and never look back. But if you keep searching, if you keep pushing for answers, you'll never escape. You'll become one of the lost, trapped in the mirrors forever." Victor's mind raced. He wanted to leave, but at the same time, something deep inside him screamed for more. The curiosity, the need to understand, was stronger than the fear. But as Zara's words sank in, the truth became clear. He was already trapped. The price of his curiosity had already been paid. The mirrors, the motel, they had already taken hold of him. He didn't know if he could leave. But as he turned to look at the door, the mirror beside it shifted. The reflection in the glass wasn't his anymore. It was Lydia, standing in the corner of the room, her eyes locked on him. Her smile was twisted, cruel, and she whispered, "You can never escape. You'll never leave. You're already one of us." Victor froze, the reality of her words hitting him hard. He felt the motel's cold fingers tightening around him, pulling him closer to the mirrors, to the darkness that waited there. The temptation to escape still burned inside him. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no escaping. The motel had already claimed him. Victor's mind raced as he stood in the center of the motel, surrounded by the darkened corridors and flickering lights. The air had grown thick, heavier than ever before, as if the very walls of the building were closing in on him. He could feel the weight of the motel pressing down, like it was alive and watching, waiting for him to make his choice. He had come this far, broken every rule, and yet the answers he had uncovered only led to more terrifying questions. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he made his way toward the room that held the mirror warden. The source of it all, the creature that had been guiding him, controlling him from the shadows. As he approached the room, a voice, this time cold and mocking, filled his head. It was the caller, but it wasn't the same voice he had heard before. This time, it sounded different, deeper, darker. "You've done well, Victor," the voice hissed. "You've played your part. Now you'll see the truth." The door to the room creaked open on its own, as though it had been waiting for him. Victor stepped inside, and the room seemed to shift around him. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not just his image, but something else. Distorted faces, twisted versions of the people who had come before him. He saw Hugo Drake's face, his eyes wide with terror. Darius Holt, his expression frozen in fear. Cameron Frost, his once proud form now hollow and empty. The souls of the lost workers, trapped forever in the mirrors, their screams silent but deafening in the air. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface rippling like water. And then, it happened. The mirror warden made itself known. It wasn't a creature, not in the way Victor had imagined. It was more than that. The warden was the motel itself, its dark power, its malevolent force, its hunger. It was the reflection of everything the motel had consumed over the years. It wasn't just an entity. It was the motel's soul, a twisted manifestation of everything it had trapped, twisted, and broken. Victor stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The mirror warden's reflection was no longer just an image. It was alive, staring back at him with cold, knowing eyes. "You're too late," it said, its voice a mixture of hundreds of voices, all overlapping each other, as if the motel itself was speaking through it. "You have already become one of us." Victor's legs trembled beneath him. He tried to move, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, trapped in the warden's gaze. The room seemed to twist around him, and the mirrors began to pulse with an unnatural energy. They weren't just mirrors anymore. They were windows into the twisted souls trapped within them. He saw the faces of the workers who had vanished, their eyes pleading for release, their voices silent but full of desperation. The caller's voice returned, louder now, almost triumphant. "You thought you were different, Victor. You thought you could break free. But you were chosen from the very beginning. You were always part of the curse. All your questions, all your choices, led to this. You are the one who will replace them. You will become part of the mirror's collection." Victor's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The caller wasn't just guiding him. It had been manipulating him from the start. Everything he had done, every step he had taken, had led him to this moment. He had been chosen, not to uncover the motel's secrets, but to become one of its lost souls. The motel had claimed him long before he had ever stepped through its doors. He turned to face the mirror warden, his mind screaming for a way out, but the warden's reflection twisted and distorted, its eyes narrowing with dark amusement. "You are already mine," it whispered. "You always have been." The room seemed to close in around him, the mirrors multiplying, their reflections growing more distorted with each passing second. The faces of the lost workers were everywhere, their eyes filled with sorrow, their mouths silently begging for release. They reached out from the mirrors, their hands pressing against the glass as if trying to pull them in. Victor's chest tightened. The fear, the dread, the hopelessness, it all came crashing down on him. The truth was inescapable. He had been part of the motel's curse from the beginning. He had been chosen to replace one of the lost workers, to become another trapped soul in the mirrors. There was no way out, no escape, not for him, not for anyone who stepped foot in this place. But even as the realization settled in, a part of Victor refused to give up. He had been fighting this battle, searching for answers, for too long. He had come so far, uncovered so much. Could he really just accept his fate? Could he let the motel claim him, make him one of its lost souls? As the mirrors closed in around him, as the shadows stretched and grew, Victor made his choice. He didn't want to be part of the motel's twisted history. He didn't want to be trapped forever in the reflections. But the price of defying the warden was too high. It was too late. The mirrors had already claimed him, and there was no turning back. With one final, desperate scream, Victor felt himself being pulled into the glass. His body, his mind, everything was consumed by the mirror. The last thing he saw was his own reflection, twisted and distorted, as he was absorbed into the dark, endless void. And then, there was nothing. Only the stillness of the mirrors, the quiet whispers of the lost souls, and the unrelenting hunger of the motel. Victor's heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged as he stood surrounded by the mirrors. The reflections of his own face stared back at him, but they weren't his. They were twisted, distorted versions of himself, each one more nightmarish than the last. He tried to push through, to smash the mirrors, but each time he did, Another appeared, always the same, always mocking him. The motel warden's laughter echoed in his ears, a low, cruel sound that filled every corner of the room. The mirrors multiplied, the glass stretching endlessly, trapping him in a maze of reflections he couldn't escape. His hand shook as he pounded on the glass again, the impact making his knuckles bleed, but the mirrors didn't break. They just shimmered and then reformed, like they were made of something other than glass, something that refused to crack or shatter. Each reflection seemed to pull him in, drawing him deeper into the nightmare. It wasn't just the mirrors anymore. The motel itself had come alive, its walls groaning and shifting like the flesh of a living creature. The floor buckled beneath his feet, the lights flickering like candles in the wind, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to reach out for him. Victor felt the panic rise in his throat, but he knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up now. He was in a battle for his soul, for his freedom, and every step forward felt like a small victory against the overwhelming force of the motel. His body moved on its own, driven by a raw, desperate need to escape. He tried running, but the walls of the motel seemed to stretch and twist, leading him back to the same place again and again. No matter how fast he moved, no matter how hard he tried to fight, the motel's grip only tightened. Then suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. Victor stopped dead in his tracks, squinting through the haze of his terror. It was Martin Hodge, the janitor, the one person who had always been lurking around the motel. Martin's face was drawn, pale, like he hadn't slept in years. He stared at Victor with a strange look in his eyes, part pity, part something darker. "You shouldn't have gone this far," Martin said, his voice hoarse and cracked. "You're too deep now. The mirrors, they don't just trap you, they change you." Victor could barely breathe. His chest was tight, his thoughts racing, and he could feel his grip on reality slipping. Was Martin trying to help him? Or was he just another part of the motel's twisted game? "You can't break free," Martin continued, stepping closer. "The motel will consume you. It's not just the mirrors, it's everything. The walls, the floors, the air you breathe. You'll never escape." His eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he was afraid of being watched. "But if you want to survive, if you want to keep your soul, you'll need to follow the rules. Don't fight it. Don't break them." Victor wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but the words stuck in his throat. Martin's advice felt more like a warning, a final attempt at survival in a place where there was no real escape. Victor had broken all the rules, and now it felt like he was too far gone to turn back. The motel had already marked him, and the force that controlled it was relentless. As Martin's form began to blur, fading in and out of focus, Victor could feel his sanity unraveling. Was Martin really there? Or was he just another illusion created by the mirrors? It was hard to tell anymore. The line between what was real and what wasn't had become too thin. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the air grew cold. A low rumble echoed through the halls, and the floor beneath Victor's feet trembled. He looked up, his eyes wide with horror, as the walls of the motel began to warp. The hallways stretched impossibly long, and the mirrors began to reflect images that weren't his own. He saw faces, more faces, of people who had disappeared long before him. They were trapped in the glass, their eyes wide with terror, reaching out for him. They whispered his name, their voices muffled by the thick, oppressive air. The motel was alive now, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, like it was breathing. Victor's pulse quickened, and he knew, deep down, that the worst was still to come. The battle for his soul wasn't over. It had only just begun. The mirror warden wasn't just playing with him. It was controlling him, bending his mind, pushing him to the edge. He was no longer sure who he was or what he was fighting for. Was it worth it to keep going, to face whatever this dark place had planned for him? Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The motel had him in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. The mirrors closed in, the glass rippling with dark energy. Victor could feel the weight of the motel pressing down on him. The walls seemed to shift, trapping him in a never-ending loop. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, each beat a reminder that he was still alive. But for how long? The warden was coming, and he could feel it. It was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. With a final, desperate cry, Victor lunged at the nearest mirror, his hands slamming against the cold surface. But instead of breaking, the glass absorbed him, pulling him inside, wrapping him in its icy grip. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the soft, mocking laugh of the mirror warden, echoing in his ears as though it had won. And then, the world went silent. Victor was trapped. The walls of the motel seemed to pulse and breathe around him, the floors shifting like they were alive, groaning under his weight. The mirror warden's presence was heavy, oppressive, filling every corner of the space. Victor could feel it watching him, could feel its eyes on him from every reflective surface. The mirrors had closed in on him, trapping him in a place between reality and nightmare. He wasn't sure if he was still awake or if he had slipped into a deeper, darker version of the world. The caller's voice echoed through the halls, its tone soft and sinister. It was no longer guiding him. It was controlling him. "You've come so far, Victor, but this is where it ends." The voice was different now, more sinister, as if it was no longer trying to help him, but to pull him under. The motel's power was too strong, its reach too wide. He felt himself slipping further into its grasp. Each step he took felt like wading through thick, suffocating darkness. The air around him was thick with the scent of mildew. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, and the mirrors reflected faces that weren't his own, twisted, contorted images of the lost souls who had come before him. Victor's mind was fraying at the edges. He was exhausted, broken. He knew there was a way out, but the cost was unbearable. The secrets of the motel were clearer now, but they were more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. He had uncovered the truth. The mirrors weren't just windows into another world. They were prisons. Prisons for souls that had broken the rules, that had dared to defy the motel's power. Souls like Hugo Drake, Darius Holt, Cameron Frost, all trapped, their essence absorbed into the glass, their bodies lost to time. And now, he realized with a sinking heart, the motel had marked him too. His name had been written in its walls long ago, and now he was just another pawn in its twisted game. But there was one last thing he hadn't fully understood, something he had missed until now. The mirror warden wasn't just a creature. It was the embodiment of the motel's dark power, the force that kept it alive, that fed on fear and sorrow. And it was offering him a choice, a chance to escape, a way out. But there was a price. The moment the truth hit him, he felt a chill run down his spine. To escape, he would have to give up everything. His memories, his identity, his soul. The choice was impossible, but he had no time. The motel was already pulling at him, trying to drag him into the glass. His body shook with the pressure of its power, his every breath becoming harder, like the air itself was being sucked from his lungs. The caller's voice was louder now, insistent. "You can leave, Victor. You can be free. But you must make a sacrifice. The mirrors will release you, but only if you take the place of one of the lost souls. You will become one of them. Forever. A part of the motel's curse." Victor felt his heart pound in his chest. He could feel his strength fading. The weight of the decision pressed on him like a stone. He looked around, but the walls were closing in, the mirrors reflecting his own desperate face, pleading with him. His legs wobbled, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands clutching his head as his mind spun. The motel was offering him freedom, but at the cost of his very essence. He could leave, but only if he let himself become another lost soul, trapped forever in the glass. But if he stayed, if he refused to make the sacrifice, the motel would consume him. He could already feel it trying to pull him deeper, wrapping around his legs, pulling at his clothes, whispering to him from the mirrors. There was no winning, no easy choice, only endless terror. He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to still. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the room going quiet. The mirrors no longer reflected his torment, but instead they showed something different. His family, his friends, a life he had lost, a world outside the motel, untouched by the horror that surrounded him. He saw the life he could have had, the life he was being offered if he took the price. But it was a lie. He knew it was a lie. He had seen the souls in the mirrors, the faces of the lost. They were never free. They never escaped. Victor stood up, his mind racing. His hand reached out, trembling, toward the nearest mirror. He could feel the cold glass against his skin, the weight of all the souls trapped inside it. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He had to fight. He couldn't let the motel win. He couldn't let the mirror warden take him, take anyone else. But as his hand touched the glass, everything stopped. The mirrors cracked, splitting into jagged lines. The world around him shattered, breaking apart into 1,000 fragments of light and shadow. The motel trembled, its power faltering. Victor's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. He didn't know if this was the end, or if it was just the beginning of something worse. The mirrors began to pulse with dark energy, and Victor heard the mirror warden's voice again, louder now, filled with rage. "You think you can escape me?" The walls began to close in, the darkness swallowing him whole. The mirrors multiplied, surrounding him, trapping him in an endless circle of reflections. Victor's mind was spinning. He could feel himself slipping away. Had he won? Had he made it out? Or was this just another trick? The last thing he saw was his own face staring back at him from every direction. Twisted, distorted, lost in the glass. And then everything went black. Was it over? Would he ever escape? Or had the motel claimed him like it had claimed so many others before? The answer was left unanswered as the shadows closed in and the mirrors hummed with an eerie silence.